Last evening's contention was the time taken between the web rendered version and the entire C-driven version. When I say web rendered version, I mean the website which has a JS stack that calls the API and the fetch and the JS rendered UI and everything. Right? The delta was about 200 milliseconds, where the JS-driven client-rendered rather version is taking anywhere between 400 to 500 milliseconds, and the server-rendered version was about 700 to 750 on average. Now today, the change came in terms of one core idea to reduce that. That was the point where we stopped last year. Today, I did take three individual choices to solve the same problem. One, do we really need an API call? If you remember from last evening, the point that I made was the SQLite resides on the same machine, and by way of disclosure, this is a very lean stack. It's almost entirely driven by C and HTML, a little bit of JavaScript for the beacon and everything, but besides that, and SQLite for the database. So it's as lean as I can probably get it to at this point in time. Right? And the SQLite runs on the same machine. There's no running per se, there is only a file. So considering it is on the same machine, do I need an API to still drive this entire operation orchestration? Number one. Yes, I do need an API for a later point in time where I will have a mobile app that will need an API call to fetch the data out. I cannot do it. Or as a matter of fact, I can still have the same web server handle that part as well. Render the entire HTML or snippets and then figure it out. Do I need a JSON API? Do I have the ability to just dump plain text with very clean demarcated like multi-part file, render it out and then split it out on the client and figure it out? That's an interesting problem to look at, probably for a later point in time. Be that as it may, going back to the crux. The first thought I had was to move this entire operation to just use SQLite libsql, SQLite3 rather, not libsql. That's another thing that I'm exploring at the moment for cross VPS. So that did give me a little bit of a headroom. Right? My first iteration brought me numbers from 700 all the way till 450 to 500. The moment I decided I'm not going to call an API, get the JSON out, and then render the HTML out. Now that it is directly coming from the SQLite database on the same machine. The second change I made was at Nginx. Nginx is my first proxy here. I did add a few interesting in the sense that I have not come across them in my work so far. There are a few interesting directives on the HTTP proxy and the HTTP versions and caching, right? So they did well, except they did well when I did a localhost call. So I did a curl time, and that came to about 0.003 seconds times. So it's like less than 100 milliseconds times naturally on the same machine. Now, when I go to the browser here and I start looking at this waterfall, waiting for server response is 99.9% of the time that actually is accounted for this entire page render, right? I mean, it is averaging anywhere between 200 to 300. So this one, if I look at it, it's like less than 200. It's more than 200. This is the first fresh load, which is why you are seeing the DNS lookup initial connection SSL and the rest of it, which do not show up in the rest of it, wherein the browser has cached all of them. It doesn't really have to go through all of that, right? Now, once I got to this point is where the beautiful rabbit hole started opening. I say beautiful with a bit of a sardonic note. There are two open items here that I still have no control over. The delay in the TLS connections and the TCP handshakes. These two are in some sense out of the control of the current setup, right? And to throw some parallel or a perspective into the API that I mentioned earlier, while it runs on the same machine, it is behind Cloudflare. So basically the setup is that it runs on my machine and my API subdomain slash root is set up on Cloudflare to come back to the same machine. So naturally there is a good bit of warm cache available for me at Cloudflare for the most part, which does give me sort of an edge there, right? That is not here on this Gamma. So the other point here is that I have two domains for Crisp. One is a .in and one is a .news. This is a latter one, and I did set up Cloudflare on the .in domain. So that is one other thing where I figured that probably the only thing left right now, because if I look at it, I've hit a wall wherein anything going forward is not really things that I can shave off of, because my entire server responds under milliseconds. Like a millisecond for the database call to render the data out as an entirely fresh cache, right? I have a 30-second in-memory cache on the server, by the way, and subsequent ones are 0 milliseconds. The entire server itself is taking much less than, like a millisecond. Now, in this entire setup, since this DNS lookup, the TLS handshake, the TLS and the TCP handshakes, they are out of the purview of the server itself. External entities cannot be managed beyond a certain point, which is where the rabbit hole sort of gave a bit of a light. In some sense, to paraphrase Zizek in a very sarcastic manner, him quoting another proverb, the light at the end of the tunnel, you never know if it's the light at the end of the tunnel or another train approaching. But looking at it in a very positive manner, I have two options here. One, push this behind Cloudflare, this entire .news domain behind Cloudflare. The concern here being, the last time I did it for the .in domain, it took nearly more than an hour for the DNS propagation for some reason. I'm a little concerned about putting this main domain behind that and have all the delays happen at this point in time, which is probably why I'm rethinking that. Until and unless I have a very compelling reason to go behind that. Number one. Number two, if I look at this page and I reload this page from scratch, right? I am emptying the cache and hard reloading the page. If you look at it, it's like 780 milliseconds. Look at the subsequent 200 milliseconds. By the time you flicker your eyes, the page is rendered. So do you really need to go any further for this particular case? I would probably bat against that at this point in time. Maybe for a later point in time, I might. But as it stands, not really anymore. That's one thing. The second thing is, it's a very interesting thought that I just had a flash while this entire recording is going on. I have an option to generate the HTML snippets right from SQLite. Can I not do a select that does a concat and returns me the HTML directly? Very well, I can. As long as I have the entire scaffold available, I just can pass it in and I can do it again, which is an interesting thought experiment. So in which case, I'm still again shaving. It might look like yak shaving, but bear with me on that point. There is a little bit of throughput that I can squeeze through this machine still. The other part of this entire equation is, should I invest further on this, or should I look at the next legs of the system? Right? So if you look at Crisp as it originally was envisioned and was built and what it is today in the Resurrection V2, it has half of it, a little more than half of it in place. Right? Now the next part of this entire thing is the content extraction, where we go and figure the page out and everything. That again is a very super lean C stack that takes about 200 milliseconds per URL, and in most cases less than that. Right? The concern there is there are cases where certain domains have issues with page content being extracted out. Number one. Second concern that I personally have is, as much as I say it's a lean stack, I am running this on a single node, a single VPS which has 512 MB of memory and one vCPU. That is a bare bones vanilla droplet, a VPS that you can get. It's not CPU optimized, it's not anything of that sort. It runs Debian 12 and that takes about 50 MB right now as an upfront, right? So when it starts up at around 470 MB, and I have about 16 to 17 of these container processors running for all these. If you look at it, this India, Middle East, and the global feeds, right? So all these included, and a few more services, a bit of housekeeping, and all those things run. So these add up to about 250 to 270 MB today. Now, when I say lean, it's everything is subjective, and the content extractor today takes about 18 to 19 MB per process, which is absolutely lean, like an emaciated kid perhaps. But in the context of this 512 MB box where 1920 other processors are running, it still is a bit heavy. So there are two other things to focus as an action item. So maybe a minor action item would be the SQLite render, but the next probable P0 item to focus on would be the content, or should it be stripping of the extra fat of the system as it were, because it does add up at some point in time, and I have spaced the content extraction process out a little bit so that it accommodates enough for the machine to run. So today when I look at the system, it is 100% CPU saturated. Is it a great idea? Probably not a great idea, but experimentally starting off with things, it's fine. And to be honest, my SSH sessions are completely fine. I taking a step back to some 7-8 years back, maybe, when we've had similar situations where the machine's CPU spiked up to 80-90%. We had concerns SSH into getting into the box via SSH, right? Today it is not the case. It is consistently 100%. If I go to my DigitalOcean droplet and observe the output graphs, the system resource graphs, it is consistently at 100%. If I zoom out completely to a 1 week view or a 14-day view, it's like a flat 100%. But when I go granular to a minute level, something, right? So considering my container processes run almost twice to thrice every second, just that I've introduced a 5-second artificial delay on it, it is a fairly quick run on things, right? So the CPU is held, it is held for that few hundred milliseconds, and then it is available for somebody else to work with, right? So it's not that much of a concern, but even that has its probable point of inflection, before which I need to see a few things in this, in on the lines of can I make it leaner? So if I say I reduce the memory footprint on this content extractor from 1819 to around 1213 MB, that's like 6 MB, right? And it's 17 of such processes, 100 MB already, right? At any point in time, I am reducing the footprint from 270 all the way to 170, right? That's a significantly high amount of memory that is being saved as such on the machine. So besides this, there are other processes running, and the other process, the content puller process, is fairly lower in terms of that, is somewhere around, if I'm right, it's around 12 to 15 depending on the number of feeds it puts in. So that's an interesting problem next to work with. So I am a little split on this, so probably I would take a call tomorrow when I revisit this entire problem of A, should I look further on the technical architectural engineering problem, that is to reduce the the fat, as it were, on the process, or do I focus a little bit more on the product side of it and work on an improvement with the content extractor that gets in better content or expands out the scope of the existing content extractor wherein it can start working with further newer domains. So these are two things that I'm sort of mulling over. Probably I will sleep over it, and that would be the one of the two would be the focus areas for my devlog tomorrow.